Yo, Latin 3. It is time for us to talk about datives. In fact, I just a few minutes ago finished making a video for Latin 1 on datives, and as you can see, I didn't even bother erasing the board after I did it. So you get to see all the stuff that Latin 1 got to see, but I'm not going to talk about that stuff. It's just still on the board. Instead, I added things for you. So, it's just that kind of day. I didn't feel like erasing the board. Maybe I'll erase it tomorrow. Maybe I won't. Who knows? I'm very tired. It's November 4th, 2020. It's November 4th. Oh, anyway. Instead, though, I am going to talk about the things the dative does that we would not talk about in Latin 1. Other things the dative does, and some things that you wouldn't maybe expect the dative to do, and hopefully we'll kind of get a handle on why the dative does those things. Because the dative, in my opinion, and I said this in the other video too, which by all means, if you need a review, go back and watch the other video. The dative, I think, is the hardest one to understand, especially for English speakers. I feel like English speakers are not great at understanding what indirect objects really are and what they're for. I honestly don't think I'm super great at explaining it. I think I do okay at it. Hopefully the video that I made on it makes sense. But the dative can also do a lot of weirder things, things that we wouldn't really call indirect objects, but definitely have an indirect relationship to what is happening in the sentence. And very oftentimes they're showing some sort of kind of personal connection to what's happening in the sentence, and maybe in some ways you wouldn't expect. So the one I'm going to start with is the dative of possession. And already some of you are going to be thinking, no, that's not the case that shows possession. Possession is shown by the genitive. And yes, the genitive, it does show possession, in addition to some other things that we talked about. But it can also be shown by the dative. So what this sentence, in its most literal sense, says is, there is no time for me. All right, as does my verb, there is. My subject is the neuter noun tempus with the adjective nullum, so there is no time for me. All right, and this is something that's not going to happen randomly. Anytime you see a dative showing possession, it is always going to be with some form of the verb sum. Probably a third person form of the verb sum, although it doesn't absolutely have to be. But it's going to be with some form of sum esse. And so, yeah, it's just saying there is no time for me. Or if you want to be less literal and really kind of emphasize the possessive nature of this, you could actually flip it around and translate this as I have no time. It's less literal, but it's very understandable in English, and it's more likely what we would actually say in English. But the most literal way is to say, there is no time for me. All right? And that is something that people do sometimes say in English. It's not the most common way that we show possession in English, but we could say it, and people do, and you would understand what was meant. All right? Although it would be a lot less catchy if the Guess Who song, No Time, instead of him screaming, I got no time, if he was saying, there is no time for me, it would be a much worse song. So let's be appreciative that they did it the way they did. Now, the dative of possession is, in a lot of ways, I think, kind of tied intimately to like the nature of like benefit, advantage, or malefit, disadvantage. But it's also very much overlapping with a dative that we did talk about in class already in Latin 3, and that's the dative of agent. I know we talked about the dative of agent because earlier this semester we learned the passive periphrastic, right? A bit with the gerundive, and like the dative of possession, the passive periphrastic has to have some version of the verb to be in it, but specifically working with the gerundive. So, the way you might translate this sentence here is, you must read me a story. Now, that's not the most literal way to translate it, but it is the easiest way to translate it and the one that is the most clear to an English speaker. But it is technically passive, so if we wanted to be more literal, and if we want to make this really sound like an agent and not a subject, then we would make it passive and say, the story must be read by you. And that's the bit that can be a little confusing, because when you say by you, you expect that to be done by an ablative, right? Usually when you have a passive sentence and an agent, it's going to be an ablative agent, all right? That's the most normal thing. But in a passive periphrastic, they don't do that. They use the dative of agent. All right, that's what they do. And part of the reason is that this S tier could be thought of as being really like a dative of possession, where you're possessing the story, but it's a story that has to be read. So it's in a way, like the most literal way you could think of this would be that there is a story for you to be read. Now that is the least useful way to translate it. It's super literal, but it's also not any way in which an English speaker would ever express themselves. So while it does make it sound more dative-y, it's not what I would recommend you to say, but it is like something that you could think of if you want to know why it is you could have a dative of agent. Then again, the dative oftentimes gets used just to show a more personal connection to something. And in fact, while I wouldn't expect to see a dative of agent with something other than passive periphrastic, I have actually seen it, and it is possible. All right? Expect dative of agents with passive periphrastics, but it is absolutely possible to see it with another kind of passive as well. I mean, talking about that personal connection to something that the dative can express really kind of bleeds perfectly into the next topic, which is the ethical dative, or the dative of personal perspective. I'm not doing great at the talking today. I'll even out myself. This is actually my second take at it. The other video, honestly, I think was going better until I just completely fell apart around minute 9. So I'm redoing this. It'll be okay. We'll get it uploaded. Anyway, getting back to the ethical dative, or the dative of personal perspective. What this sentence says is, for me, your story was dumb and slow. That's not a very nice thing to say about somebody's story. But the whole point of this sentence is that it's expressing an opinion. And it expresses that opinion by, having a statement here and then having the dative in there. And the dative is not receiving something. It's not benefiting by something. It's not doing anything as an agent. It's not even possessing anything. It's literally just showing the perspective. And if you wanted to be a little less literal in a way that emphasizes that it's an opinion or a perspective, you could, instead of saying for me, you could say something like for my part. But you really don't have to do that. I mean, this is something that we do in English, is sometimes we indicate that it's somebody's opinion or perspective just by saying for. And very oftentimes this is in fact done with this specific word, for me, because people often do it when they're expressing their own opinions. Some grammars will even distinguish the terms ethical and personal perspective as, referring to one person versus somebody else. But they really are the same idea, something showing a perspective or an opinion on something. And it can be done with any noun or pronoun, but again, it's usually me, he that you're going to see, if you see that at all. And speaking of showing a personal connection to something, the dative sometimes will do the job of another case to make it sound more intense or more, again, personally connected. We already talked about possession, but did you know, bet you didn't, that there's also something called the dative of separation? And again, some of you are probably thinking, no, that's another case. That's not the job of a dative. That's the job of an ablative. And in fact, based on the word ablative, that's one of the main jobs of an ablative, is to show separation. But you could totally see a sentence like this one, right, where it says, has life stolen from him his love of laughing. All right? Of course, what's going on here is I've got my subject life. I've got my verb has stolen, in this case formed as a question. I've got a direct object, right? Amorem, the love, and even a genitive, which I think we could call an objective genitive. His love of laughing. And then I'm translating this as from him, even though it's in the dative, right? And usually you would think of the dative as for him. Has life stolen for him his love of laughing? You could say that, but that really obscures the meaning in English. That's not what we would say in English. We would say, has life stolen from him? Even though it's a dative, you would still say from, because this is so clearly showing separation. When you take into account the meanings of all the other words, nothing else really makes sense, and yet there's a dative there. Now, you could totally have done ilo instead of ili and used an actual ablative and done the more typical separation. But if you want to like basically make it like more personally impactful, then you use the dative to show like kind of the more intense connection between the person from whom things are being separated and the thing separated. Catullus does do this sometimes, so I can guarantee that in Latin 3 you will see this. You're never going to see it as much as the ablative of separation, because the ablative is the main case that shows separation. But you can see it, and you will. And I promise, when you see it, I'm going to point it out. All right? Now that gets at almost everything. There is one more that I need to talk about, and it is, in a way, the one that, at least by the name of it, sounds the most ridiculous. And you've actually heard me refer to this. I have on occasion referred to the dative of purpose. But this is also called the double dative, because according to some grammars, this dative of purpose only shows up with another dative. Now, I personally, and this is probably controversial to say because I'm sure at some point one of my colleagues will see this and think, you're wrong, but I personally don't see what would be wrong with using a dative of purpose without another dative. But according to like Allen and Greeno and some others, this only shows up when there are two datives. And certainly, even if I am right and it doesn't have to be that way, it will still be that way most of the time. And that's if I'm right. I could be wrong. But what's going on here is that a dative can show purpose. A dative can show a reason why something is done. And again, this is a little surprising because there are other ways to show purpose in Latin. There's actually a few. But if it's a simple enough idea, you can do it with a dative. And the reason why it's called the double dative is because according to Allen and Greeno, and again, many others, it will always show up with a dative essentially of benefit or advantage. So what this sentence says is, I will sing a song. So, canum carmen, that's the easy part. That's the subject slash verb or implied subject slash verb and the direct object. And then my dative of advantage here is actually the vobis. I will sing a song for you, tuo fructui, for your enjoyment. And this is the purpose for which I am singing a song for you. So this would be my dative of purpose, my dative of advantage, and together these make up a double dative. I know it's a lot to think about. Now, like I said, I am convinced that there would be nothing wrong with having a sentence that just had the dative of purpose in it, but again, expect to see it as a double dative, where one of them is purpose and the other is benefit or advantage. And of course, we already know about benefit advantage. Even though your Ecce Romani books don't talk about it, I certainly do. So you better know that one. All right? I wouldn't deviate from the book if I didn't think it was important. That's a lot. Obviously, we're going to be talking about this again, so do be expecting it soon, and expect us as we read Catullus. If you're watching this before we've read very much Catullus, obviously if you're watching this afterward, then this comment doesn't apply. But if you're watching this before we read very much more Catullus, do expect to talk about it as we read Catullus, because he actually kind of loves using a lot of these. The dative of possession, dative of agent, dative of separation. Catullus uses all of these. So definitely look out for it there, and look out for it in other poets too, especially as we progress on to Latin 4. You're going to see it in Horace. So, all right, that's long enough. I will get this uploaded hopefully today, November 4th. If not today, it'll at least be this week. And yeah, I'll see you guys in class.